Um, my name's Tim Huffman, and I am a community action scholar. And so part of what I do is I teach at a university, but how I teach and how I research is always in conversation with broader social issues. And so I think of myself as a social justice communication scholar, which is to say that I think about and try to engage in communicative practices that contribute to the flourishing of people in the world. And by taking a social justice frame, the worry is most urgently about people for whom the world sucks the most. And so there are issues, everybody has issues, right? All people have problems. But when you think about justice, you think first about people whose problems are really very pressing. And so that usually ends up looking like something like marginalization or poverty, or being the victims of some kind of extreme violence or injustice. And so for me personally, the issues that are nearest and dearest to my heart are in and around issues of homelessness. And so I do a lot of thinking and scholarship and volunteering and activism relating to homes and how people get them and how they have access to them, and services to people who do or don't have homes, who don't have homes, or people who do but have them in very tenuous ways. And so my field of specialty in communication is organizational communication, which is to say I ask questions about how humans try to accomplish things together. But of course that bears down or plays out in the context of homelessness, because there are all of these social service organizations, there are all of these organizations, workplaces that homeless people are trying to access, and that the question of organizing is really pretty relevant to questions of poverty and marginalization. So that's a summary. How's that?
Yeah, that's great. What you think could be improved, that could be like physically or just like generally?
Yeah, so St. Louis, like most metropolitan areas, is the victim of gentrification. In some ways, processes of gentrification, they're good for some people in some ways, but they have real victims. And so if you notice how the city got built up, there's investment in one particular place in the city, and then investments start growing maybe north of the downtown area. And so people who are poor live in the older areas that were downtown, and people who are wealthier live now north. And then there's a reinvestment out west. And so now poor people are moving to fill where wealthier people used to live, and the money is being invested here, right? But now there are new efforts to reinvest in the downtown area, right? And when you start to think about it like that, it's this kind of like endless fluid cycle where really the rich people are chasing the poor people around the city. Because when you think about what a real estate investment is, all entrepreneurship is about taking something from here where it has a lower value and bringing something here to where it has higher value. But when you think of real estate, which can't move, what you do is you take something here that is currently perceived as having low value, and you reinvest in it such that it seems like it has more value and people will buy it there. And so what that overall, over generations, it looks like is I have basically things that are undervalued being purchased out from under the people who are impoverished that live there, being invested by real estate developers and then sold to middle and upper middle class people. And that it constitutes an ongoing diaspora, basically. It's this like migration around the city over and over and over again. And I actually think it's bad for wealthy people too, because the more we move, the fewer connections that we have to the people around us. And so it fractures our sense of place and community and relationship. But when you're wealthy, you can solve problems that those things used to solve with money. But when you aren't wealthy, when you lose your social capital, you lose the most important set of networks that you use to solve your everyday problems and accomplish the things in your everyday life. And so to say that we're chasing each other around the city is to say that for not particularly good reasons, we're becoming less connected to each other as we run around the city. And so, is there a specific place of the city that needs improvement? I'm not going to say is a bad question, but that's not really the way that I think about it. Because to improve something that is currently broken is to, in some ways, if you do it the wrong way, to push out the people who currently live there and pave the way for someone else to come in, right? And so if we say, oh, North County has been disinvested in, let's redevelop North County. If we do that in a way that hedges out the people who currently live there by making the value of that property not something that those people can afford, or not the property that we who live there can afford, right? Then we didn't solve the problem, right? We just kept churning the pot. And so the way I think about investment or how we can improve things is to ask strategic questions about how can we improve a particular part of the city, but who are we improving it for? And then when you add that kind of for whom consideration, it becomes, you'd be able to answer the question in a more just way.
Do you think when you're talking about my role, I guess, like in our class when we're talking about intercultural communication, do you think that like plays a big role in this sort of like lack of communication between people in wealth who are coming into these communities and people who are less wealthy, and not being able to like, find understanding between these two groups for them to be like, well, hey, like this is our community,
right.
Like this is how.
Yeah, I mean the way that we talk to each other, of course, influences the way things develop in the worlds that we make, right? Because we make worlds together, and so if we're not together, we're necessarily going to make different worlds. And I'm not an intercultural scholar, but I think of it at the kind of level of community or organization. And so the idea of differences that can't be worked across is a thing I think about a lot. And if I don't know you, and if I fear you, and if I worry that you're part of why I don't trust the universe, then I'm not going to engage you in my everyday life in a way that's going to give us any sense of shared stake. And so then when I sit around and solve problems, even if I'm trying to solve your problem, I'm going to solve it my way. And that's going to almost always be wrong. Just in the same way that somebody trying to tell you how to live your life usually pisses you off. That pisses everybody off, right? And so part of the solution then, or not even the solution, I don't like to talk in terms of solution. Part of the way forward is to say, okay, how have these conversations happened in the past? And how can they happen in a future that involves more voices from more people? And better seeks both the enhancement of life, but also the liberty of all of the people who are involved.
Okay. So that kind of covers our next question, which was about how do you like move forward in these situations,
right?
From that, or to make improvements. So this is kind of going another direction, I guess. But in your time here in St. Louis, have you I guess, like, can you tell us about a time where you felt, like, most comfortable or at home, and then, like, at a time where you felt, like, least comfortable?
I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know if I ever... I don't know if there's a place that I don't feel at home. There are some times that I worry that I am impinging on the privacy of others. And so sometimes I worry that the people that I'm around would rather I wasn't there because I'm kind of bothering them. But I don't know, there's not like a part of the city where I feel like these aren't my people. I mean, if that ever happens, it's, in wealthy parts of the city. As opposed to the alternative.
Is there a reason why, like, that, just because it's not a group you identify with, or?
I mean, I don't disidentify with people who have wealth. But, so, my activism and scholarship centers around homelessness,
right.
Which is a radical form of poverty. And so, poverty is something that I think about a lot, and I think that the most persistent message in our society about wealth and poverty is that wealth is good and poverty is bad. And I have found that is less true than we talk about. And that there are hidden and beautiful ways that poverty reveals to us that which is most important in life. And there are distorting and deceiving aspects of wealth that cause us to lose a sense of who we are. And because I am pushed, we are all pushed by the discourses of more will make you happier. I find myself meditating on how having less will make me happier more often than how more will make me happy. And so I guess I feel like my heart yearns more to be broken than to need nothing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, there's no like right or wrong answers to these questions.
Right, but did I answer it is my question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess kind of following up on that, when you're talking about wealth and poverty, like could you like define like how you define them?
Sure. Yeah. There are lots of definitions of poverty. My favorite definition of poverty is that which leads to an early death. Because I think that when you think about poverty that way, you have a more kind of vibrant sense of all of the different ways someone can be poor. You can have wealth, but make a series of decisions that get you dead. In a way that actually reveals that despite having a full checking account and being able to lock your door behind you, that you were still poor. I think that I think about wealth and poverty also in the kind of classic sense of how much financial capital that you have. But I think that capital itself is an important way of understanding what poverty is. And so for me, capital is the ability to make change in the world. And so there are actually a lot of ways to make change in the world. One of those ways is having money, but one of those ways is having friends. And others of those ways is to be able to frame issues for other people, or to have credibility or rapport with particular groups of people. And so I think of wealth and poverty kind of in this multidimensional landscape of capital, wherein I can make the changes that I need to in the world around me through all of these different mechanisms. And then I guess lastly, the thing I think about is sometimes wealth is framed in what I own or what I have, and I tend to think about human thriving and what do I need in order to thrive in certain ways. And so I do not own Forest Park. I do not own Tower Grove, but I have access to those places, which doesn't contribute to my wealth in like the classic sense of what it means to own something, but I think that it decreases my impoverishedness in important ways because it gives me richness and beauty that enhances my life. And so, yeah, that which leads to an early death is poverty. That which makes me unable to act in the world is poverty. And that which detracts from my ability to access the things that I need in order to be fully human is poverty.
So would you consider like those words like poverty, wealth, like to just kind of be like placeholders for all these other things, or just like labels for?
Yeah, I mean, everything is a placeholder, depending on your kind of theory of language. And so there isn't really like an essential thing that we should be calling it. If like what we're calling it is always built on this kind of web of signification. So yes, it's a placeholder. I think that in some ways, wealth and poverty are kind of like, they're almost like hyperlinks if you want to think about it that way, right? Like I can say, oh, like I'm interested in alleviating poverty, and then that kind of triggers this other discourse, right? And yeah, you're right, they are placeholders that are more complicated than they might seem. And in some ways that's a good thing, right? Strategic ambiguity is not always bad. Sometimes it's okay that when I say poverty, I think one thing, but you think another thing. Because then we might actually be able to organize and accomplish important things, even though we actually disagree on why we're even doing it. That being said, wealth and poverty have become angel and devil words in our society. You'll notice that political candidates almost never use the word poor. They'll say things like, oh, I want a strong middle class and I want to build ladders to the middle class. Well, where the hell do you build that ladder from, right? You could just say, I am working for people who have some money and people who have none. But we don't like that. Like, poverty is so stigmatized in our culture of, if you can make it here if you try, that we don't even like to say the word impoverished or poor or destitute. And those, they're like dirty words, right? Whereas like wealth creation, if someone said, well, I engage in investment for the purpose of wealth creation, people would be like, oh, that's awesome, right? As opposed to asking, well, like wealth for whom, and wealth at what ways, and wealth at the cost of what else, right?
So in terms of like bringing this labels like of people, I mean, you don't have to, it's not just like limited to like, well, I was just gonna ask like what labels like you would, I guess, like claim for yourself, and it doesn't have to just be within like the context of wealth and poverty, but I guess just thinking about how you just talked about those terms and sort of like how people view them, and then what it means to like take on those things.
Sure.
If you could just speak.
Yeah. I mean, so labels is a thing that in and around issues of homelessness, you have to think about all the time. There are so many ways to refer to the lived experience of not having stable housing. So sometimes people just say, the homeless, right? But usually that gets kind of picked apart because it's essentializing, it's making someone equal their position, and you're not even using the word person, right? And so the homeless is probably the least articulate way of saying it, right? I help the homeless. Which is not to say that you might not have a pure heart when you frame it that way, but yeah, that's definitely a label. And then there are homeless people, right? So that's like, oh, at least I'm admitting that they're people, right? But then I'm describing them as homeless, right? So then there's another layer, which is like people who are homeless, which, okay, the emphasis there is on people, right? Like, so that's good, right? But anyway, some people talk about people experiencing homelessness. There's another one, which is people without homes, which sounds to me a whole lot like homeless people, but other people like that one more. I like the term people living homelessly. But yeah, anyway, so all of these labels, and each of them has like a different, a kind of different connotation, a different implication. Mm-hmm. People suffering from homelessness, is another way of framing it, which frames them as not responsible for it, but also victimizes them and maybe erodes their agency. So yeah, it's complicated. And then even in my own life, so I, for 6 months of my life, lived homelessly, and so, but how that gets talked about and whether or not someone thinks that's a legitimate or illegitimate experience or what it allows me to talk about or not talk about is also all contested, right? So, yeah, labels, they're a whole thing. Because for me, like, I'm a teacher, right? Because I teach people, but I'm also a college professor, but I'm also an activist. And so how I deploy those identities kind of depends on the situation and who I'm talking about. Sometimes I just want to say teacher and be done with it. And then my wife will be like, well, you're a college professor. You teach at a university. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but I don't need to be more important than grade school teachers. Like, I just teach people. But then there'll be another situation, well, basically, I'm like, no, like, I'm a scholar activist, right? And part of being a scholar activist is teaching classes, right? But I'm engaged in this ambitious task of trying to know the world differently so that it becomes better. And I don't know, labels, yeah, they're a thing.
So would you say it's like helpful in the conversation to use them, but where it falls to be kind of dangerous? Like when you're talking about the different labels people associate with homelessness, how there's like, if you use like this term, the associations with that, like how do you kind of, I guess, do like a cost benefits association with those kinds of things?
The terms, yeah. I mean, the first thing that I would say, so labels are not the only words that we can use to describe things. We have names, and we can use those. Those are not labels. They're still words, and it's not like names don't have a cost either. But there's a liberation theologian that says, so you say you care about the poor, name them. And so the first thing that I would say is you can avoid using labels by knowing people. And so I don't need to say, oh, I met this homeless person on the street, if you talk to them and you know that their name is Sarah. And so labels as a linguistic function are just plain old necessary. Like, I need to be able to talk about classes of objects, things, and persons so as to make sense of the universe and the world. But the first way you can break through is to just know people. And so you can think about your friends and the things that your friends go through. And I guess friend is a label too. But if you knew people in the particular circumstances that you wanted to talk about, you could just talk about them. To answer your question more specifically, but eventually you can't just talk about the people that you know. You might have to talk about groups. And so, yeah, I do think about I hate labels that are hard to say, and I resent them. And so I very rarely use the word I don't like the construction of people without homes. There's just that, for me, that's hard to say. I do sometimes say homeless people. I most often try to say people living homelessly. But that one's also weird, but I don't know why that one makes more sense to me. And to be honest, the way that I came on that one is I used to describe myself as having lived homelessly, as opposed to describing myself as homeless. And I didn't know why, but I never felt right about saying, oh, I was a homeless person. That sounded a silly thing to say. And so I said that I lived homelessly. And then I had a person who had been homeless who said, I really like that. I wasn't just homeless. I was living out there on the streets. I was living homelessly. And I was like, oh, well, I like it. He likes it. Maybe that's just the one that I should say, right? So I don't know. I don't know if there's a principled way of doing a cost-benefit analysis. Part of it is recognizing the linguistic community that you're in and speaking to them in ways that they can hear. So I'm not evangelical about a particular term or label. I'm more just an advocate that people be thoughtful about the labels that they use. Because how we categorize something that's basically how we think, right? And there are times that changing a label changes the whole way that we think about. And I find myself, when I use the word cops as opposed to police officers, I think differently about cops than I do police officers. Because when I say police officer, I think of a person whose chosen profession is to engage in a certain kind of law enforcement. And when I think about cops, I think of those guys with guns who, and so the labels do discipline our thinking. And so there's not a right, for me, it's not so much that there's a right or a wrong one, but that we should be careful about the ones that we use, because it really is where our thinking becomes, most clear.
Do you think there's an aspect of like privilege like that comes into play when you're kind of coming up with these labels? Like for your situation, we were talking about how you didn't want to like call yourself like a homeless person versus like someone who might not have had access or like experience to like another thing. Like
right, or they. So I can imagine a person who's doesn't want to move with their parents. They're 19 years old. Their parents get a job somewhere else, and they decide that they're going to couch their on a friend's apartment, and then they're going to get an apartment of their own. And that doesn't end up working out. They get kicked out of that place, so they stay with another friend for a couple weeks, and that doesn't work, and they get kicked out, and they have no place to go. They have no key to any place, and so they sleep in parking lots, or under a bridge, or behind a business. But eventually they have run out of money, they've run out of food, they've run out of resources, and so they go to an organization, and in order to access the services of that organization, you have to be homeless. That's what the organization does. It serves homeless people. It says it right there on the sign. It says it right there in the thing. When you talk to people on the streets, that's what they talk about, and that's how they talk about it. And so in order to get something from that organization, you have to identify yourself as constituted within the set of people that they help in order to get their services. So abso-fucking-lutely, my privilege to solve my problems without accessing charitable organizations gives me more freedom about how I identify. And that you have to then identify yourself as homeless in order, you have to walk in and say, yes, I don't have a home. Whereas if you didn't need that help, if you were still working and had health insurance and had a car and had all the money that you needed to solve all of your problems, you wouldn't have to identify as homeless. You might think of yourself as just not having a place to stay right now. And that might be the label that you use. And that's absolutely a privilege to be able to say, this is the situation that I'm in, but it's not really who I am. Because who you are doesn't have to be strategically construed in order to access the resources that you need in order to not die.
Yeah, that definitely goes to what you asked. The rest of the questions were just, you kind of answered them. When you were talking before, if you've ever been labeled something based on stereotypes, and then what the situation was, and have you ever, this last one was about like if you've ever felt judged by someone for expressing yourself, or for something that you didn't have control over. I don't know if you really kind of was you covered.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the labels that get attached to me as an educated, male, heterosexual, white person are good ones. So a lot of times I don't have to fight stigma. I remember the first day I taught as a graduate student, and I walked down the hallway, and one of the people in my department said, "Oh, Tim, you look so professorial." What the fuck about me is professorial, right? I was wearing a tie. And what they were speaking to is, gosh, as an undergraduate, you dressed with holes in your jeans and you looked like a wreck, and now you actually look nice. But I looked more like, the guy in the Dead Poets Society because I was white and a guy, and I had a certain frame, of reference that I spoke to, and my linguistic structure was in a particular way, and so I got labeled early on as professorial, right? Whereas other graduate students had different bodies and different pasts and different histories and different things. And so, I mean, if I was going to speak about labels, I would not waste your camera time and go, oh, well, this one time, you know, people didn't respect me when they found out that I didn't have a home, or people thought I was mentally ill when, you know, I was living homelessly, or, oh, you know, I struggle not being able to articulate whether I'm a teacher or a scholar or an activist. I would use your camera real time to say that in my life, labels have systematically advantaged me, and I'm honest about that to my core, and that if anything, the thing that makes me most uncomfortable about labels in my own life are the implicit and systematic advantages that labels give me, because the way that and it's labels, but it's also all words. How I use language got disciplined in me because of a certain set of structures, but it's also valued because of a certain set of structures. And so the fact that saying like a bunch of times and putting a rising tone at the end of my expressions, I was never taught to do that, and I live in a world that respects the falling tone and the lack of fillers. I can say and authoritatively, and people are like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. It's stupid. So, yeah, there it is, labels. That's me admitting the labels in my life.
Great. This wasn't one of our questions, but this is just kind of something Professor Johnson has like proposed in class. Do you think like we can, since we are sort of defined by this certain language system that we've used and like been socialized in, if there's like any way to fix that system or like change those things, like when we have to like work within it, like how do you change something so radically when you don't have the language to do so?
Right. Well, we make new languages is the answer. I firmly believe that what a better world looks like is what it takes to get there. And what I mean by that is that if you were to list out all of the things that you wanted to happen in a perfect world, I'd want everybody to be included. I'd want people to be able to express themselves. I'd want people to be able to be who they are without fear of having that pulled away from them. I'd want people to be involved in broad decision-making processes such that the world that we built was one that reflected the diversity of all of the people who then needed to live in that world. So you make me this list of all the things that you want in your perfect world, right? And then I would say, well, how do we get there? Well, we would get there through conversation with each other, which is basically what you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. Us being involved in each other's life. I would make it so that in those conversations with each other, there were ways of layering decision making such that it was polyvocal, right? Which is getting at that kind of equity thing. And so the fact that it's part of the problem, I think is awesome, because most of the shit we're in, we made, which means that if we make it differently, it will be different. And so I am heartened by the fact that language systems control outcomes, because if we change our language systems, we control the outcomes. And we're never going to get it perfectly, but today we can get tomorrow better, and tomorrow we'll figure that out too, and we can make the day after that better. And that if we have an ongoing commitment to engaging each other in important ways, but also creating spaces for us to disengage from each other when we need a fucking break, and to be able to move in and out of each other's lives interdependently and respectfully and in a way that celebrates who we are and makes us become more human, then that is what a better world looks like. And I do believe that labels and language is part of that, because what it means to be a slave is a languaged reality. And the label slave has ethical import, has ontological import,
has import on the way that we think about what the world is, and it changes the nature of my relationship to that other person. And if we just say, slave isn't a useful way of thinking about persons, in fact, I would want that never a single person should ever be thought of as slave, and we can rid ourselves of that word and all of the ideas that go with it, well, that goes away. We erase it. And not that those erasures don't come with incredible economic upheaval, extraordinary crisis of identity, and leave us with a intense amount of ambiguity about how the world will move forward. But they can be changed, they have been changed, and they will be changed. And that's just the end of that.
Great.